Go ahead and start the recording. Awesome. Good morning, everyone. This is Ruth Buchanan welcoming you all from our Florida Makes headquarters in downtown Orlando. We are so excited to bring you this session today, a very timely, relevant topic that has been percolating around in so many circles. So we decided to do this for you in quick fashion. We were at Tallahassee at the manufacturing days, and then this topic came up. And so happy to share this with you with my friend Mike, with me helping me craft this topic. So today we're talking about tariffs. We will understand the basics and then the latest as they pertain to Florida manufacturers. So we will stay within this overall guideline. There's so much to talk about tariffs, but that is the overall guideline that we will go by today. And let me make sure I can control it. Okay. Cannot control it. Can you move the slide for me? It's not moving for me. We just practiced this a moment ago. Thank you, Connor. So that is me. We'll move along. Florida Makes, our mission is to improve the productivity and technological performance of Florida's manufacturing sector. And our vision is undergoing some change, but for now, we are the recognized leader for strengthening and advancing Florida's manufacturing economy. And we do cover a lot of things that we're able to help our manufacturers in the state of Florida, being the state MEP. Mike will have some language on the MEP in a moment, but these are 6 capability bullets that we are using to help all of you understand, and our partners in the network to help share what Florida Makes can do for manufacturers. We cover technology acceleration and innovation. Cybersecurity is a big deal. In fact, we have a webinar on that in a couple of weeks. IP is important. Supply chain is always important, right? And then our bread and butter, as I call it, is a performance assessment and continuous improvement that we do for our manufacturers. Workforce training is important as well. You need workers, trained, skilled workers to do your mission. And of course, we're here to help businesses, manufacturing businesses grow. Key takeaways for today. Keep this in the back of your mind as we go through the next 88 minutes. Get comfortable on the key concepts around tariffs by learning what they are. And we figure we're also going to learn what they are not, because that's important. And then we're going to hear the latest updates on tariffs in a fast-changing environment. Separate fact from fiction. I love this part. And believe me, we were updating the slides up to like a few minutes ago. And then we will learn potential outcomes. This gets technical, so I encourage everybody to pay attention as our keynote, our primary speaker on tariffs will talk about outcomes and how to mitigate the impact. And then finally, you will learn the tools and resources available to you as a Florida manufacturer. So it is my pleasure to bring you an esteemed set of panelists today. We have my teammate, Michael Aller. We've been together all week. So Mike will go first and talk about tariffs and what they are not, and go a little bit in economic theory, because that's important that we understand that. Mike is a key member of our team here, so I'm honored to have him. And then Deborah will come and do the bulk of the presentation at the middle. Todd will introduce her some more in a bit. And Todd is our board member, Florida Makes, a lawyer, a finance person, so much experience there and knowledge. Todd, thank you for your leadership for this webinar series. So you'll hear from Todd at the end as well. And so without further ado, I think we're going to turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, everyone. Look forward to a great discussion today. There's a lot of very interesting things to talk about, a lot of dynamism in the tariff conversation right now, the trade conversation, and that has a lot of implications for all of us. So next slide, please. So first of all, a little bit about Florida Makes. We are all about technology adoption, business growth, and talent development, as Ruth outlined before. We're all about trying to deliver high-impact products and services and resources for our manufacturers, including programs like this one that we're having today, and try to help support you not only in increasing the size and value proposition of your network, but also helping improve the effectiveness of our overall ecosystem and awareness of the importance of manufacturing across the state. So to that end, we work very closely with a lot of other partners across the country. We are actually part of it's called the National Institute of Science and Technology Manufacturing Extension Partnership. It's a program that has affiliates in all 50 states and Puerto Rico. We are Florida Makes is the NIST MEP affiliate for the state of Florida. And this program offers a number of different resources in business growth, in exporting and reshoring, in supply chain supplier scouting, in advanced technology, risk mitigation, cybersecurity, and a number of other areas. And there's a lot more information available at nist.gov/MEP if you want to learn more. Next slide. But first of all, one of the aspects, as I talked about, is highlighting the importance of manufacturing and the awareness of manufacturing in the state of Florida. And we're very excited to be able to work with the Florida Department of Commerce about a year ago on a program, on a report all about manufacturing in the state of Florida. And one of the big takeaways from that report is that Florida is, in fact, a manufacturing state and a very important manufacturing state. And manufacturing is a critical industry for the state of Florida. And is actually manufacturing in Florida is growing faster than it is in manufacturing in any other large state across the country. So that's a really great story that we have to tell, and something that many people, including many folks within the manufacturing industry, don't know about. So that's something that we're trying to highlight. And also manufacturing in Florida and manufacturing overall has an enormous impact and integration with international trade. Overall, a couple of years ago in 2022, out of U.S. Exported almost $1.6 trillion in manufactured goods, which was nearly 80% of all of our merchandise exports in that year. And Florida exported more than $62 billion, which was about 4% of the total in the U.S. And also manufacturing accounted for over 90% of Florida's merchandise exports. So manufacturing and exporting is an enormous part of international trade in general, is an enormous part of Florida's economy. Next slide. So just to talk a little bit about tariffs and what tariffs are. So tariffs are taxes that are levied on goods when they cross an international border. In some cases, the border that applies is actually a customs union, such as the European Union, where there's a group of countries or a group of economies that come together and establish a common border, which becomes the border that tariff is imposed upon. But there are a number of different reasons why tariffs have been imposed over the years. And the primary ones are, first of all, to be able to regulate the trade internationally, to provide protection to domestic industries, oftentimes from unfair practices or for specific policy reasons, as we're seeing today. A third reason, which was important in early parts of the United States and less so recently, but is to generate revenue for the government that's imposing the tariff. That has been less important in recent years. But one thing that we're seeing oftentimes and very much recently is to provide leverage for international negotiations. So, and then there are a couple of different types of tariffs. So there are tariffs that are imposed to offset unfair trading practices. Those are often called countervailing duties. And the types of trade practices that are involved are things like subsidies or manipulation of currencies, some cases intellectual property rights. And there is also anti-dumping actions, which are when it's found that another country has been selling goods in our country at below market prices to try to flood the market. And then there is a process for addressing those. Next slide, please. So tariffs are basically, they have their own system. They're imposed, they're set up on something called the harmonized system, which is a classification system, which is set up internationally by the World Customs Organization, which is nearly all countries across the world have come up with a system to identify specific goods and by their name, their use, or the material that they're used in their construction. And then they assign a specific classification number for that. And then each individual tariff code gets assigned a tariff amount, and that's how a tariff is calculated. In the U.S., the U.S. Constitution actually gives Congress the power to set import tariffs. That was one of the original parts of the Constitution. But over time, and especially over the last last 100 years, Congress has delegated quite a lot of this power to the president and independent agencies through a series of laws that basically lay out the policies and procedures around imposing tariffs. And so they're enforced primarily by customs authorities, which in the U.S. is Customs and Border Patrol. And then they're adjudicated. There is an appeals process, but they're adjudicated through a series of specialized agencies, which we'll talk about, and a series of specialized trade courts, in fact. And there is an international trade system overseen by an organization called the World Trade Organization that helped set up to provide guidelines for the international trade system and mediate trade disputes. There has been quite a bit of controversy around the World Trade Organization in recent years because many countries have been wanting to impose more barriers than the World Trade Organization rules currently allow. And so that's a lot of activity that's been happening recently, but there is an existing international framework that's supposed to oversee these. In terms of the economic effects of tariffs, there's a lot on the slide, but we're just going to focus on a couple of key items. One is that tariffs ultimately adjust the price of goods within an economy. Typically, in most economies, the world price is below the domestic price that would be incurred without trade. And so therefore, there's a benefit to consumers by engaging in trade and a benefit overall to the economy. However, when a tariff is imposed, that typically allows domestic producers to charge a premium above world prices. But that also means that many manufacturers who are also importers themselves are often needing to pay more for the goods and components that they need to make their products. So that it does have a impact of potentially raising costs and narrowing margins for a lot of manufacturing firms when a tariff goes into place. The other thing that happened is they often impact quite substantially the costs and dynamics of international trade. So oftentimes, a tariff being imposed by one country creates retaliation by others. That's what's called a trade war. And that can create friction, especially for companies who are in the business of exporting. And they also can incentivize some significant shifts in patterns of investment. So companies can begin to shift where they invest in order to try to avoid some of these trade barriers. But overall, what tariffs inject into a system is they inject a degree of uncertainty. And oftentimes markets hate uncertainty. And so therefore you often get, even the threat of tariffs, you get a risk premium that gets injected into a market and into the marketplace simply by the discussion of tariffs. Next slide, please. In terms of the U.S. system, we have a number of different resources that support our international trades system. Key among these is the International Trade Commission, which supports, it actually manages the harmonized tariff schedule for the United States. It also does analysis and evaluates tariff actions and tariff implications, identifies whether or not there's material harm to a U.S. industry based on tariff barrier in another country. U.S. International Trade Administration does supports a number of different initiatives in support of exports, but they also do a number of investigations regarding the impact of trade activity and tariff barriers on U.S. companies. The Bureau of Industry and Security administers our export control system, so they manage and make sure that there's not proliferation of weapons or articles that have dual use that we wouldn't want to go other places. The U.S. Trade Representative administers the Section 301 unfair trade barrier process, which Deb will talk about in further detail. And then, of course, U.S. Customs and Border Protection are the police on the ground that actually police and enforce our tariffs. And now we'll move on to Deb to talk about many of these other opportunities.
Yes, thank you so much, Mike. And again, those slides will be shared with everyone after this, because Mike has put together some really good information packet. Before I move on to Todd to introduce Deb, the chat is very busy. So go ahead and put your questions in there. I've been seeing them, and some of those questions will be addressed by Deb in the primary presentation. And I see somebody raise their hand. In the interest of time, and because of the lot of effort we put together in presenting the material, you are allowed to ask questions in the chat. So Lacey, I'm afraid we will not be able to give you the microphone. So moving on to Todd, you're next. Go ahead and tell us all about Deb, please.
Thank you, Ruth. I was going to start with the paraphrase of the old expression, you may not be interested in tariffs, but if you're a manufacturer, tariffs are very interested in you. But looking at the chat here, I see it's not necessary to say that. This is a very curious and engaged audience. So then it goes nearly without saying, but I'll say very briefly that we are in a time of extraordinary change. Any environment in which part of your supply chain is subject to double-digit price fluctuations on a seemingly random basis quite suddenly has to be called, if nothing else. There may be many positive aspects to that, but there's no denying there's a significant element of danger to that environment. So our purpose today is to insulate you here from those dangers. In medical terms, today is for the diagnosis, and the watchword for manufacturers, first of all, don't die, don't let tariffs harm you, and after that we will be talking at a later date about how to turn these dangers into opportunities. So your doctor today is Deborah B. Stern. Deb is the real thing and a terrific resource for us to make available to Florida manufacturers today. Her extended bio will be in the chat. You can see the details of her experience, but to summarize them, much of that experience previously was in writing the rules and the government decisions that we're going to be talking about today. Her practice now is in helping people like you and businesses like yours navigate the dangers of the field that she used to be one of the principal drafters of. So Deb comes to us from Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg, which is a national customs and trade law firm, which happened to pop up in my feed yesterday, prominently quoted by The Economist magazine on exactly this subject, how to avoid the negative effects of these tariffs. And personally, I am probably here not just because I'm a member of the Florida Makes board, but because I have known Deb Stern since before she was a nationally prized trade law expert, in fact, before she was a lawyer. So it gives me great satisfaction to bring her in the full professional flower of her customs expertise and make her expertise available to all of you. Deb, welcome.
No, I'm.
Oh, you need to unmute, Deb.
I'm so sorry. Here I am. I'm trying to share my screen and do too many things at once, as as is very common today. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Todd is right. He has known me since before I went to law school. and has been an incredible mentor to me over the years. And I'm so privileged to be here with you all today. Thank you so much to the Florida Makes team and for all of you for your time. I have put my screen up.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We have changed our tech and upgraded, and because really Deb has been giving up to the last minute update, so she had added stuff to her slides. So just give her a moment to put up the slide. And in my haste, I did not properly introduce Todd. I don't think I did. So Todd, thank you for joining us again. You are the impetus behind this topic. You brought us Deb, and Todd is the president and CEO of Florida First Capital Finance Corporation, a wonderful not-for-profit finance institution that is really instrumental in helping bring funding to our manufacturers. 504s are through them, and also other SSBCI. I think Deb is hooked up. So okay, there we go. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you again. My apologies. And truly, as you all know, because you're all following these issues closely, we are truly working it just in time, if you will, but by the minute on updates. So first, as Todd said, I'm a partner at Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. We are a boutique customs and trade firm. We are not only national, we are actually international. We have offices in Hong Kong and China. We have professionals in Canada, in the Dominican Republic. We have affiliated firms also that we work with throughout the globe. That becomes very critical because, of course, not only are we working here locally, but we have a lot of questions for goods that we export. We have an export controls practice. We have a government affairs team for advocacy. We do litigation, trade remedies, and core customs and import compliance, including all of the other government agencies that control all of the goods, that control various goods coming across the border. So with that, we have a very deep bench. We are actually the largest boutique customs and trade firm of our kind. I say the only entities that I think technically are larger than us are the consulting firms that also sometimes have trade practices. So let's get it right into it. As you may be already familiar, the Trump 2.0, President Trump's second term, has made an America First trade policy. And I thought this quote was very interesting because it talks about establishing a robust and reinvigorated trade policy that promotes investment, productivity, etc., and above all benefits American workers, manufacturers, farmers, ranchers, entrepreneurs, and businesses. We have to be nimble. We have to be well informed in order to do any changes to account for what's going on. So first, within this America Trade First policy, America First trade policy, there was a mandate issued to all of the agencies within the administration, within the executive branch, that basically that touch trade. And I'm not going to walk through all of this, but all of the different measures that are available to address and redress trade imbalances all of those agencies are subject to providing a report to the president, most of them by April 1st. They need to address whether, which, and what measures can and should be imposed to carry out the benefit to workers, manufacturers, and businesses. So let's start off with a little bit what's going to come out. I should say what's going to come out of these reports is, as you may imagine, the president may or may not take into account what any of the agencies say. We already know that he has executive orders ready to go for April 2nd for some issues. It's so we need to be prepared, keep our ears to the ground on all of those changes that are coming, but also, take a look at those reports very carefully because they will allow us to have some sort of crystal ball into what might come. So let's start with some fact or fiction first. When we have these conversations, what happens, what comes up a lot is, what's the difference between duties and tariffs? Are duties and tariffs different? No, they are not. They are synonymous. Whether they are your base duty rate that's provided for in the tariff schedule, the 2%, 5%, whatever that your goods used to only be subject to, and that the free trade agreements allow you to eliminate. That's again, we call it a duty. It is also a tariff. The 232 tariffs, the 301 tariffs, the Mexico tariffs, the Canada tariffs, all the things we're going to be talking about, they're all duties, tariffs. The words are interchangeable, so I will use them interchangeably today. Fact or fiction number 2, only Congress is vested with the power to impose tariffs. Fiction, while the Constitution vests authority in Congress for tariffs, the Congress has delegated portions of tariff authority to the president. And although that authority comes with certain conditions and restrictions that are provided for in the statutes, such as investigations, public notice and comment, the president, of course, also has executive order authority. Do tariffs on Canada and Mexico violate the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement? Fiction. The USMCA has an essential security exception that allows measures it considers necessary for the fulfillment of its obligations to maintain or restore peace, security, and for the protection of its own essential security interests. Now, that definition in the USMCA, which the last Trump administration had renegotiated from NAFTA, the former agreement, this definition is broader than the prior essential security exception, and essentially means that the administration can declare, an economic crisis, a national security crisis, and impose tariffs that do not violate the agreement or arguably do not violate the agreement. Fact or fiction number 4, the president does not need Congress's approval to enact tariffs. Fact, if a national emergency is declared or to mitigate a serious balance of payments deficits, and we'll talk about that in a moment, the president does not require congressional approval to act. So under certain statutes, there is no congressional approval required. There are for other means. Now, the one the national emergency provision, again, that many of the statutes do provide for this. We're going to talk a lot about the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It's called IEPA. So if you hear me say IEPA, that's what I'm referring to. Not to be confused with an anti-dumping statute called EPA, EAPA, which is the Enforce and Protect Act, also a measure that is used by the government and notably by U.S. Customs and the Department of Commerce to enforce trade remedies on anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which we'll talk about briefly today as well. So what are the possible actions that can be taken, and what is the likelihood that they will be taken? Well, as I just mentioned, IEPA, we're going to be talking a lot about today. IEPA vests virtually all powers of trade to the president. No investigation is required. No notice and comment is required. And we have already seen the use of this. It's not the first time that a president has thought to use this act. Actually, it used to be called Trading with the Enemy Act. It was replaced in 1977 or revised and replaced basically with the IEPA. President Nixon had actually imposed some tariffs under the Trading with the Enemy Act, but the current actions, in particular against China, and have been threatened under for Canada and Mexico under IEPA, is the first time a president has used this authority. And again, there are very few, if any, guardrails on that authority. Now, there's also the Trade Expansion Act, Section 232. We have seen that used obviously most recently during the first Trump administration for the steel and aluminum tariffs. Section 301 of the Tariff Act of 1974, yes, I'm jumping ahead for a moment, is the authority under which what we call China 301 tariffs were imposed. We don't have other 301 actions right now, so I'll generally refer to those for the rest of the presentation as China 301. The Trade Act of 1974 has some other provisions, including Section 122, and we do anticipate that this one is likely to be used. It allows for tariffs up to 15% to be imposed for up to 150 days, although that is extendable as well by the president. And this is again a kind of another sort of a emergency act, but in particular, this is where there is a balance of payments deficit, and arguably, where there's a trade deficit with any country, we could see that. So, for example, we might see that invoked for the threatened EU tariffs. Although again, it's only up to 15%, and so if the president wants to go to 25%, we would likely see that under the IEPA as well. There are other measures like removal of the permanent normal trade relations from China. That actually requires Congress. It is possible. There are bills pending. There are, again, another Section 201 has already been invoked for other measures, but not under the current administration. And you can see we have a number of other provisions, doubling of tax rates on foreign citizens and corporations, the ability to prohibit imports, and these are less likely measures, but we do expect to see the possibility. There's a possibility of another 301 investigation. We definitely have already seen the expansion of the 232 actions. We expect to see more emergency actions. So the pre-existing actions, these are all pretty recent, and they're subject to high enforcement. And I bring that up because I would be remiss if I didn't. The current and new actions, the new actions are not the only things we have to worry about. We do have to worry about all of the existing actions as well, how to manage those, how to mitigate those, how to be compliant with them. Because they are subject to high enforcement. And so that the top ones are the China 301 duties, which are on many goods of Chinese origin, but not all goods of Chinese origin. And those rates vary from 7.5% to 25%, depending upon the tariff classification of that article. The Steel 232 on aluminum and steel, I'm sorry, that's how I called it, the Steel 232, the Section 232 duties on steel and aluminum. There is also a new investigation of 232 that was just announced last week on copper. Obviously, these are very critical to all manufacturers because those the raw materials are what have traditionally been subject to the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs since the last administration. And again, copper is next on the list. There's also 201 actions against solar cells and solar modules, as well as large residential washers. There are a plethora of anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders, and a lot of these are on raw materials, and a lot of them are on raw materials out of China, but not all. There are various anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders. Anti-dumping duties are duties that are imposed when there has been a determination made that products are being sold from a given country at less than fair market value. Countervailing duties are those that are imposed when the determination has been made that companies, that exporters of a given country are receiving substantial subsidies that create unfair trade advantages, again, allow them to sell into the market lower. Anti-dumping duties can vary from 10% all the way up to 350%. Sometimes we've even seen up to 1,000% on anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders. That process is initiated by domestic producers, domestic industry. The U.S. International Trade Commission makes a determination of import injury, and then the Department of Commerce is the one that administers and interprets the order. So those duties can apply in addition to duties that are imposed for any of these other measures. In fact, all of these are duties in addition to the base duty and other measures. It's also important to bear in mind the key right now is supply chain transparency and supply chain security because of forced labor. Their forced labor orders and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, what we call UFLPA. This requires that goods in the supply chain that arrive in the United States are not made with forced labor, and there are certain regions or countries where forced labor is done by definition. Anything North Korea is defined by the law as forced. The Uyghur region of China under the UFLPA is now deemed forced. In other instances, it'll be case by case, and there's different measures that the government uses to do that. Now, this doesn't result in duties, but what it does result in is the detention of goods, and the onus becomes on the importer to prove that there is no forced labor in the supply chain. And so whereas historically a purchaser may only need to know, a US importer or distributor may only need to know its first tier vendor, now with these measures, the Lacey Act as well is on wood products, the control of wood products. Now it's important that companies are communicating with their vendors to ensure that they have vetted second, third, fourth tier vendors for forced labor, for other measures. There's also a conflict minerals requirement. These measures affect whether goods can even come in the country at all. So even if, as a manufacturer, you're not the importer, you're not importing them, you're not going to get your goods if the government detains them. So it's important to be aware of them and to be on top of all of your vendors, even if you're not the importer of record. Now, new tariff actions. We have as I mentioned, the president initiated orders under the IEPA to impose, this was last month, to impose 10%, which, as many of you may already be aware, is supposed to go up on Tuesday to 20%. We'll talk about that in a moment. They have tried to remove the de minimis exemption, which allows for goods under shipments under $800 per individual consignee, individual purchaser, to come in without duty or any other requirements. There are some limitations on the de minimis already relating to, for example, other government agency controls, like if it's a food product, it is not eligible for de minimis, but many components are. And many products are. It's often used for e-commerce. That is also on the chopping block for China. However, that order had to be paused due to administration and enforcement of the order. There are many challenges for U.S. Customs to actually employ this. The Colombia duties that were, I think this was day 1, 2, or 3. I have a slide on it. There were duties threatened on Colombia that has been paused. Duties threatened on Canada and Mexico. Those are currently paused. There are new steel and aluminum duties coming online March 12th or later. Most of them will be on March 12th, but there's a certain list we'll talk about that may come into play, may be subject to duties later. There is this reciprocal tariff study. So in addition to the America First studies that all of the agencies are having to report on, they now also, as of 2 weeks ago, have to, I think it was on the 13th actually, have to look into reciprocal tariffs. And what does that mean? We'll talk about that in a few moments, but essentially it's if U.S. goods are subject to 15% duty into Brazil, well, then Brazil's stuff should be subject to 15%. That's the basic premise of what we call a reciprocal tariff. But it is it'll be quite a bit more than that. In terms of, it's not just going to necessarily be a 1-for-1, and of course it may not actually come into play, but we'll wait and see. There's also been new tariff actions threatened on automotive, on pharmaceuticals, and on semiconductors as of April 2nd. So while I mentioned before that all of the agencies are supposed to be reporting on April 1st, we already know that there are executive orders drafted and waiting to go out on April 2nd, at least for certain industries. There's also been a threat for 25% tariffs on the EU. Now, what we know is that this was no different from the first term, is that if the threat has been made, it will by and large be carried out, although not entirely. Some threats are used for negotiation, but certainly we know that the administration has made good on those threats if they aren't getting the reciprocity that they're looking for or the concessions that they're looking for. So up to the minute developments. Right after I had put my slides together and send them over to Ruth, the very next morning, we saw that there was an announcement that the suspended Canada and Mexico tariffs, which we did expect would remain suspended for a little while at least, will in fact go into effect on March 4th, or are scheduled to do so. It wasn't a huge surprise. It was just we didn't expect to hear anything like in the way that we did. But what was the real surprise on Wednesday was that as you'll see the line, the third to end, China will likewise be charged an additional 10% tariff. This is the universal tariff. The universal tariff that was already imposed 10% on all Chinese goods, which is in addition to the 301 duties where those are applicable. So now that 10% is going to 20, apparently on Tuesday. So I want to give you a little bit of background, because what we're seeing, what we're feeling is, quite frankly, whiplash, right? Since January 21st, there has been this plethora of actions and announcements and expectations, which are creating a lot of challenges for importers, manufacturers, and everyone else. We had about 6 hours where Colombia was going to have 25% goods, 25% tariff on its goods. And that was going to be raised to 50, travel bans, visa sanctions, enhanced customs inspections, bank sanctions, you name it, the works. The administration, the president was going to throw every tool in the arsenal at Colombia in order to require that it take back deportees, that illegal immigrants that were being deported back to Colombia. After the mutual presidents had a few conversations, an agreement was come to, and that tariff threat went away. So next on our list was Canada, and I'm sorry, that says our tariff threat. It should have said 40. And I apologize. The final slide version that you'll see will have the correction. But on February 1st, President Trump announced 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods except energy goods, which would have a 10% tariff. And the intention was that they would go into effect on February 4th. There would be no exclusions process to carve out any exceptions. And there are some very broad definitions in not just the executive order, but more importantly, the Federal Register notice that was published to implement those tariffs. And by this broad definition, I mean, you're probably already familiar with the fact that the China 301 tariffs are based on the origin rule. How do we determine it's Chinese? Called substantial transformation. And that basically requires that there be a fairly complex production or assembly operation occurring in that country in order for the product to be a good of that country. So as we expected, now the USMCA's rules of origin for qualifying for that agreement, for that duty-free treatment out of Canada or Mexico, those are different rules. Those are called tariff shift rules, or tariff shift plus regional value content, meaning the value of the production and materials from those countries. The Federal Register notice was to say nothing of the USMCA qualification itself. What it's saying is 25% on the basis of either substantial transformation or the NAFTA marking rules. This is under Part 102 of the Code of Federal Regulations. We call them the 102 rules or the NAFTA marking rules. They're still called the NAFTA marking rules, even though USMCA overtook NAFTA. And they are a set of tariff shift rules, and they are a very liberal set of tariff shift rules designed to complement the NAFTA agreement and provide for how goods are supposed to be marked. Now, there is a section of the 102 rules that are specific to textiles and apparel, and those tariff shift rules are actually used for substantial transformation. Every other product area, the substantial transformation test is entirely distinct from the tariff shift rules found in the regulations. And this is important because the Federal Register notice says you're going to be a product of Canada subject to these additional 25% tariffs if you are either Canadian by substantial transformation or Canadian by the 102 rules as appropriate or as applicable. And so there is a question of whether this was intended to mean textiles and apparels only because those are the substantial transformation rules, or whether it was to mean everything. Right now, we don't have a firm answer because this action was rescinded. The Federal Register notice was rescinded when President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau came to an agreement to delay the tariffs until March 4th. And US Customs and the Department of Commerce are not offering any opinions or any clarification on that notice. And we don't know with certainty right now whether that same notice will be reissued next week or next month or whenever these tariffs will go into effect, or whether there will be modifications, whether there will be clarifications. All of that remains to be seen. What we do know is as of Wednesday, the president has said he plans to go forward with the Canadian tariffs on March 4th. Now, there are still 4 or 5 days left between now and then. So there is still the possibility of negotiations. And we are hearing that there is a possibility they will be further delayed to April 2nd. We don't know what will happen after that. And again, don't take my word for it. We're all still planning for Tuesday. If you're doing your scenario planning, disaster planning, whatever you want to call it, it is important to understand, this is what we expect. We don't have certainty. We don't know exactly what that new Federal Register notice will say, but we can anticipate that it'll look largely the same. And there are a lot of other nuances within that notice about the timing of the goods arriving, about how to use a foreign trade zone. If any of you are operating in a foreign trade zone, we can always talk about those questions afterwards or offline. But we again, all we can expect right now is that what we've seen before is likely what we'll see again. Now, Mexico's tariff threat, that one was about 44 hours, something like that at the time on February 1st. 25% tariffs on the basis of IEPA for drugs and immigration issues. Same justification for Canada, was supposed to go into effect February 4th. Now this one, very different from Canada, no Federal Register notice was ever published for Mexico. So what we're doing is surmising that it will look a lot like the Canadian Federal Register notice, but we don't know that with certainty. So again, we can expect substantial transformation will be one of the rules to determine a product of Mexico subject to these new tariffs. We can also expect, or at least plan for, the 102 rules also being applicable, with that open question of, did he really mean all the products or did he only mean textiles and apparel? We just don't know. Now, we do know that at the time, back on February 1st, President Sheinbaum threatened retaliation. And then on February 3rd, the day before the tariffs were supposed to go into effect, Trump and Sheinbaum resolved to delay the tariffs. Again, same thing with Canada. Concessions were made and delay to March 4th. Now, this past week, just before the president announced that he intends to move forward with the Canadian and Mexican tariffs, President Sheinbaum was saying, and cited in news reports, that an agreement may be reached by today to avoid delay. Or to avoid or delay. We don't know the status of those negotiations right now, but I will also caution to say, despite what the news tells us or what the social media outlets tell us, until we see an executive order and a Federal Register notice, the mechanics, the details, the actual initiation of the action hasn't happened yet, right? So as with Canada, Trump did say Mexico will move forward, in practically the same, within the same 12 hours that Sheinbaum says we're going to come to an agreement. So as I said, plan for March 4th, but we do have some sort of expectation that we could see a delay at least until April 2nd on Mexico as well. Now, China is a whole different story, right? So nobody is balking at the increase in China tariffs. even back at the beginning on February 1st, when the president announced that there would be a 10% universal tariff that is on all Chinese goods. And very surprisingly, also said products of China includes products of Hong Kong. This is the first time that Hong Kong has not been treated as a distinct country of origin for customs and tariff purposes. There's not a ton, made in Hong Kong, but there's enough that certainly has an impact. So these did go into effect on February 4th. There was a delay for goods in transit on or before February 1st, and there is some very wonky language in terms of what does in transit on or before February 1st mean. But generally there is this delay to, it's actually 12:01 a.m. on March 7th is when the duties will be, goods coming in will be subject to the additional 10% if they had been in transit and their final mode of transportation prior to February 1st. So February 4th, 10% in addition to any other tariffs that apply. Now, there are some exclusions in that order, unlike Mexico and Canada. Chapter 98, which some of you may be familiar with, the Chapter 98 provisions, it's referring to the Chapter 98 of the Harmonized Tariff Schedule that Mike went over. Chapter 98 provides not only for certain specific exemptions relating to, for example, articles for the handicapped and blind, certain agricultural products, U.S. goods returned to the United States, previously imported foreign goods returned within 3 years, and also outward processing. So if you are, if there is some production occurring outside the U.S. but with U.S. inputs, there is a partial exemption or a partial duty exemption for the value of the U.S. inputs. Similarly, if you're sending out goods to another country for repair or alteration, which has a specific tariff definition, something very short of substantial transformation. So if you send it out and it's substantially transformed, it is no longer eligible for that repair or alteration partial exemption. But anyway, these are exemptions that are available for these particular actions. Certain donations, goods for personal use, and informational materials are exempt from this additional 10, now 20, soon to be 20%. We don't know, actually, I'll tell you, there's been some questions that have come up about what does the information materials exclusion mean? Does it include books? Does it include, pamphlets? Does it include, we don't know. That's being worked out right now, through various advocacy efforts. If we can get some more guidance from Customs and Commerce on what is intended for that exemption. Obviously doesn't apply to most of you, but it's good to know that it is there. Goods that are subject to the tariffs initially were ineligible for the de minimis. Again, that means everything Chinese origin was ineligible for the de minimis exemption that I talked about. That has been reversed again because it was inadministrable at the time. We do expect to see it come back online once Customs and Commerce have the measures in place to be able to enforce it and administer it. These tariffs are cumulative. All these tariffs are cumulative, meaning on top of the 301 tariffs, on top of anti-dumping and countervailing, on top of the regular duty rate, on top of any steel 232, aluminum 232. These are all cumulative tariffs. So you may have a product that might be regularly duty free, but now is subject to 10 different layers of additional tariffs. Now, that being said, there are a number of 301, China 301 exclusions that still apply. And if you're not familiar with this, back when the 301 action was first taken in 2018, included in that process was the opportunity to apply for an exclusion from the tariffs for specific products, and in some cases entire tariff codes, but in most cases specific products. Only some of those exclusions remain, but They do remain until the end of May of this year. We don't expect them to be extended at this point, but they are there, and they still apply. So you still pay the 10%. Well, you'll pay the 10%, but not the 301 duty if you are eligible for that exclusion. Whereas under the 301 action, a company that manufactures, brings in, manufactures, then exports, or utilizes any of the other means of what we call duty drawback, the 301 tariffs were eligible for duty drawback. The 232 tariffs were also eligible for 232 drawback. So if your goods were subject to those tariffs at importation, you've made something, or you're storing them and then you export them out of the United States, there's a process to recover those duties. That will still work for 301 tariffs. It does not work for this new universal tariff against all Chinese goods. If you are utilizing a foreign trade zone, or want to consider utilizing a foreign trade zone if you're not already, which allows you to defer the payment of duties on imported goods where you are manufacturing, or in some cases, some companies just use the FTZ as a distribution center, but you all are manufacturers. There are a number of rules applicable to foreign trade zones where it's really a duty deferral. In the past, and for the regular duties, a foreign trade zone allowed you to use what we called an inverse tariff. So if all of your parts and components have duty rates varying from 3 to 10%, but your finished good, if you were to have imported it, is only subject to 2.5%, the FTZ program allows you to bring in all those components, not pay the duties, make your product in the zone, and then bring your product out of the zone at only the 2.5% that the finished good is subject to. And this is why you see a lot of auto manufacturers doing this, because all the automotive components have varying rates. The finished passenger vehicle is only 2.5%. Obviously, cargo vehicles, pickup trucks, those are 25%. That's the chicken tax. I'm sure you're all familiar with that expression now. But anyway, the foreign trade zone had that benefit. With the imposition of the China 301 tariffs, there's a complicated process of doing it, but your finished good is still subject to the 301 tariffs that were applicable for all the components that went into it, but not until you take those goods out of the zone. So that could be anywhere from, a month to 2 years to 5 years. And again, as we've seen this week, President Trump has indicated he is going to double the China universal tariff on March 4th. We do expect that to move forward on March 4th. We don't really see that there's a lot of negotiations going on between the president, between President Xi and President Trump right now that could affect that. And we don't see any advocates coming forward to say, hey, this isn't a good idea. This isn't working, because certainly coming forward and taking a public stance against China right now is not generally considered a good idea. Now, other new actions. I've mentioned the steel and aluminum tariffs. They have been increased. So the action that occurred or that will be going into effect on March 12th, which was announced 2 weeks ago. The steel and aluminum tariffs, steel has already been at 25%. These are on certain raw materials, again, based on their tariff code. But there was also some exceptions for certain countries based on origin, like our free trade agreement partners, Australia, Korea, etc., Canada, Mexico, and 10% on aluminum. And then there were designated derivatives. And those derivatives, which were also subject, like bumper stampings for automobiles, those were determined by tariff code plus the specific description of like that bumper stamping, or a nail, or a screw. I'm sorry, not a screw, but a nail. The additional tariffs that will go into effect on March 12th or later for certain derivatives is going to eliminate all of the exemptions, the country exemptions, as well as the specific, the general approved, exclusion. It will increase aluminum from 10% to 25%. And there is a new derivative list that is much broader than the original derivative list. It's based on HTS code only, and it's a lot of components of certain goods. But when you look at the list, you'll see it includes furniture. It includes antennas for communication apparatus, and not just the big antennas, but the tiny itty bitty ones. It includes other parts of communication apparatus, like a router. So looking at, I guess, the aluminum enclosure, for example. The derivatives list, if the product itself is classified as a steel or as an aluminum article, those duties go into effect on March 12th against the full value of the good. For the derivatives that are like the furniture and certain sporting equipment, again, parts of communication apparatus, those will go into effect when the Secretary of Commerce certifies that there are systems in place to administer those tariffs. There are a lot of complications because the additional tariffs will only apply to the steel and aluminum content. And there's some interpretive questions about how to determine what is the steel or aluminum content of some of these goods. And there's also some concerns from industry, as you might imagine, about it being incredibly onerous and to have very little reward. For example, using the example of the antenna, or rather any other parts of communication equipment that have a very, very tiny bit of aluminum, and the majority of the value of the product itself is in the good itself that isn't aluminum or steel. Anyway, there's challenging questions about how this is going to be applied, which is part of the reason why that effective date for certain derivatives may not go into effect on the 12th. But again, very important to be aware that that these issues are there, to get familiar with the steel and aluminum list. I'm happy to share it with anyone individually if you want to reach out. There's also an exemption under the steel and aluminum tariffs if there is U.S. melt and pour or U.S. smelt and cast. Melt and pour being for steel, smelt and cast for, actually, I might have had that backwards. I apologize. But you've got to be able to prove it. So the documentation from the mill, from the U.S. mill for anything that you might, be sourcing here, but is sent abroad to be converted into a finished product, or a finished component. Tracing, being able to prove that it was U.S. Melt and pour or U.S. smelt and cast, is going to be very important to avoid the increase in the steel and aluminum tariffs. All right, next. We just keep going, don't we? So we talked about the other reciprocal tariffs that might come on board. February 13th is when these were announced. And it's important to note the White House fact sheet on these reciprocal tariffs cites specifically to Brazil, India, the EU, and the other countries that use a digital services tax. And the reason that's important is because we can be fairly certain that those are targets. We already know the EU is a target. We know that President Modi and President Trump have been in negotiations about Indian tariffs. And we actually know that I think there are some concessions, some negotiations were open because of this announcement. So we don't know certainly whether some of these threats of reciprocal tariffs are being used as a negotiating tactic, or whether they will in fact move forward, or to what extent they may move forward. We know that they won't be imposed for the most part until sometime after April 1st. The president does state that he's going to rely on those agency reports that were mandated, and use whatever legal authority is needed. So it may not be under IEPA. It may not be under that section 122 where he can implement up to 15% for 150 days. It's possible that that could be the result of there could be a new not China 301, section 301 investigation, or a 232. There's different measures. They'll figure out which measure, apparently per trading partner. So now if you can imagine, there's 200 countries in the world, or thereabouts. we trade with most of them on some level or another. A reciprocal tariff determined country by country and potentially sector by sector or product by product is going to be incredibly, incredibly challenging to manage. So, we may or may not see it. They may decide to do something that is just by country, which will still be very challenging. But if you do any business with the EU, you know that the EU tariff, when you send goods over to the EU, they have their tariff system kind of itemizes by country and trade agreement. It's really just a different format of how we identify which countries benefit from a trade agreement here into the United States. But it could look more like the tariff, but maybe 10 or 15 times bigger. Because we have so many countries that we do trade with that may be subject to these. But as I gave the example before of if Brazil charges 15% on US goods, then the reciprocal tariff could be 15% on Brazilian goods. But it's going to be more. There's going to be more than just looking at the tariff rate. The announcement, the executive order, and I believe the White House fact sheet both mentioned that they might factor in the VAT, which, as some of you probably know, the VAT gets reimbursed at export. But I digress. But the VAT, other non-tariff barrier restrictions, and again, they may be imposed in certain products, certain sectors. So what these are going to look like, how they're going to be implemented, on which countries, how extensive. All of these are great questions that we don't know the answers to, other than we obviously see specific targets that we can expect will come first. So let's get back to a little bit of fact or fiction. Now that we have gotten information overload on more details than you ever wanted to know about these things,
Hey,
and that's
Deb.
yes.
Deb, this is Ruth. So yeah, no, great information, and a lot of questions are actually to be addressed by your next slide. So this is also just a time check. It's 11:09. So go ahead and fact and fiction, and then the next slides here will address several of the questions in the Q&A. Thanks, Deb.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ruth. So fact or fiction? We're stuck paying the new tariffs, increasing our costs, eating up our profits, risking our customer base, forced layoffs. We're stuck with them, right? Fiction. There are a number, and I think I saw somebody comment earlier in the program, there are a number of lawful cost-saving strategies that might be right for your business to avoid or mitigate and recover or recover some tariffs. There are obviously some instances where you might be stuck with one, but we can mitigate somewhere else. Sounds great, right? But hey, we aren't the importer. We're a manufacturer. We're buying from an importer, from a distributor. There's nothing we can do. Fiction. You can take control of your imported components and materials by taking on the onus of becoming the importer of record, by employing the strategies to avoid, mitigate, or recover. Or if you don't want to become the importer of record, because there is a big onus that comes with that, and there's a whole slew of things we can talk about offline about becoming an importer of record, you can exercise your buying power and your relationships with your suppliers, even if you're not the importer of record, right? Nobody says you have to rely entirely on the importer and their negotiations. Talk with your importer. Talk directly with the vendors if you can. I'm doing a project right now for a client who is purely a domestic producer, but they're collaborating and cooperating with the company that they're purchasing from. And I'm working with their customs counsel, and we're coming up with strategies together, because ultimately, right, it's your bottom line that's being affected by the price that you're going to be charged as a result of these increases. So you can do something about it, whether or not you're the importer. Last fact or fiction. I need to invest in a trade consultant or attorney to do this. Fact. And I say this only because navigating the maze of trade compliance and the sea of chaos that we are in does require a knowledgeable team and subject matter experts. But I promise you the juice is worth the squeeze. So let's talk a little bit about avoid, mitigate, and recover. Now, I'm just giving you very high level points right now because we have another program where we're going to delve into all of these things. Not every opportunity that we can employ as a cost saving strategy is going to work for everything you do or even any of what you do. But looking at the options, sitting down, talking through, can we do this? Can we do that? I'm sure that there are some solutions that will help to reduce the impact of the tariffs. First is tariff engineering. And also corollary to that, origin engineering, or what we call operational engineering. These would not, they're not going to allow you to avoid the new tariffs that are universally applied across an entire country. Sorry, the tariff engineering and tariff classification won't be, but they can be used to reduce liabilities for the base duty and for other, like the China 301 tariffs. Origin engineering. Right. Again, if we have a universal tariff, changing your vendor from, China to the Philippines may not make a difference. But until the Philippines becomes a target, which they're not right now, if you can shift production or shift just enough of production of your components to another country, that will allow you to have a different country of origin and affect what whether and how much your goods are going to be subject to a particular tariff measure. Free trade agreements, preference programs, like those Chapter 98 provisions I talked about. These are all things that we can look at to see, can we reduce the tariffs? And again, it may not be the universal tariff that we are able to mitigate, but if we can offset other measures, that's what we can do. Taking advantage of exclusions that do exist or that may become available through legislative, executive, and regulatory advocacy. Using your voice, very, very critical. So we'll go into these programs and go through some examples in an upcoming program, but we wanted to give you a little taste of what's out there. For mitigation, we can look at how the valuation, tariffs are applied on a predominantly on an ad valorem basis, meaning on a percentage of value. So if your good is if your widget is $100, and your tariff rate's 5%, it's $5, right? So now what if you can legitimately reduce that $100 declared value to U.S. Customs to $80 or $70 or even, even $90? Any little bit is going to help offset. And you'll have to look at, we have a robust first sale program, which again, we'll talk about in our next program, but that allows you to use an earlier sale in the transaction, factory to middleman, middleman to importer. If we set it up the right way, we can use that price that's factory to middleman rather than middleman to importer. And that can result in huge savings. Again, you're still subject to all of the tariffs, but now you've reduced the value against which those are applied. Again, reclassifying your merchandise legitimately. Tariff classification happens to be my bread and butter, my sweet spot, the thing I started doing when I first got into U.S. Customs years ago, and still do a ton of today. There are some gray areas in how goods are classified. There is also just a lot of people not getting it quite right, and there's opportunity there to determine whether there's a better provision with a lower duty rate. Trade remedy reviews in the anti-dumping and countervailing space. There are a number of opportunities to participate in administrative reviews, get scope rulings to try to carve out your product away from the anti-dumping duties, work with your manufacturer to get specific rates to reduce the trade remedies that your imported components and raw materials may be subject to. And again, it's not going to mitigate the universal China 20%, but it is going to mitigate the other duty lines that you have if you can employ some of these measures. Duty deferral, I mentioned the foreign trade zone, for example. Bonded warehouses, again, allow you to delay. So maybe just a matter of cash flow. We know we're going to be subject to the tariffs at some point, but maybe we can, just like we want to do it with the IRS, is we can kick that can down the road. and pay it later instead of now. And there's also the duty drawback program. Again, it's not going to apply to the universal tariffs because it's not going to be permitted, but it will apply to a number of others. And then recovering. So not only do you want to find the savings, but there are also opportunities to actually go back a certain period and pull back duties that you've already paid. And there's a couple of different programs that are available for that. And there's also, in case you're not already aware, there's been a long-standing court action against what we call lists 3 and 4, the third and fourth tranches of the China 301 tariffs. That litigation is still open. It is currently pending at the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. It is actually not too late to join that litigation. Why would you want to join that litigation if you actually been an importer and subject to those tariffs? Because hey, wouldn't a favorable decision apply to everybody? Not necessarily. We've seen in the past where cases are resolved in the favor only of those parties that are plaintiffs. Now, we hope that if it's a favorable result, it's going to apply to everybody, but it's possible that it wouldn't. So again, happy to answer questions about that as well. Ultimately, you want to ensure that any claim to recover tariffs is well supported and that you've taken into account all other considerations about whether, when, and how to make those claims. Now, last point here, I think it's just always very important is, what are the best practices here to employ all of these measures? First, again, get professional help. And this is not just me selling my services. I don't care who you use. I, of course, think I do it better, but I don't care who you use as long as you're not doing it on your own. Because these are really complicated measures. There's a lot of procedural nuances. And there's also a lot to be said for knowing the agency, having relationships with the agency to accomplish more than you could do on your own. Just like, you don't necessarily reach out to your congressman directly. You might join an advocacy group and allow the government, or you hire a government affairs professional to do that for you because they know, they have the relationships, they know how to speak the language. It's very, it's the same with the Department of Commerce, the U.S. Trade Representative, U.S. Customs. Keep an audit trail of whatever you do that is, employing a preferential program or benefit, because if you are an importer, reasonable care is your standard. It's functionally equivalent to due diligence, and it's your insurance policy to avoid to ensure that even if customs or decides that we don't agree with your new classification or your new valuation, that you're not going to be subject to penalties, and that you can just reasonably defend the action. You want to communicate all of the requirements that you have for any program that you might be taking, and also just the tariffs themselves to your vendors. Again, you can negotiate with your vendors for lower prices. It's not except for anti-dumping and countervailing duties where your vendor cannot reimburse you for duties. For all of the other tariff actions, there are opportunities to negotiate lower prices. There's nothing wrong with that. Any service provider you are using, particularly customs brokers and freight forwarders, you want to make sure that you have good oversight over them, that they're not doing anything without authorization, and you want a proactive compliance set of protections, which not only includes programs, but having vendor agreements, certifications, corporate policies, internal controls, audit procedures, et cetera, et cetera. And again, we'll revisit that in the next program as well, as it applies to a lot of the programs we're talking about. But I think it's a good idea to just have in mind right now, no matter what you do, these are the best practices for making sure that you do it well and correctly. And finally, information. Florida Makes is obviously an amazing resource for all sorts of information for your industry, for the trade issues specifically. We're also happy to have you receive our daily trade report. We have it in Spanish, some versions in Spanish as well. And we have a podcast, 2 Minutes in Trade. And we have a plethora of professionals always available to answer questions. So with that, questions.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Deborah, for such an exhaustive presentation on a huge topic. I hope that those of you that have stayed with us the entire hour and a half have gotten a lot of value. And I will start to address, we were active in the chat, the questions. So just some quick ones that we can address as a group. Yes, Deborah's contact information, her company's information will be in the slide. The slide deck will be shared with you. That's going to come from me as a separate email. So expect that from me with her full contact information. There is a follow-up email from Zoom directly that will give you the link to the video recording of this webinar so you can share it. And then there'll be a survey after that that we will ask you to provide additional input because we need to hear from you. As Deb had referenced a few times, we are planning on Tariff 2.0 webinar to help our manufacturers. All right. So a lot of questions were answered in the, like more on the detail actually, Deb. So thank you for moving that along. Talk about, it seems like there's a couple of questions on exemptions, but it sounds like as far as we know, Deb, this is for you, there is really no guidance yet. And it seems like whatever exemptions existed in the past are actually going away. What are your thoughts on that?
So there are some exemptions that are still available. So for example, in the Steel 232 exclusions that are company specific, they are still even after March 12th, they remain in effect until they expire. But what is gone is the general exclusion, the generally approved exclusion for certain products that applied to everybody. That is gone as of March 12th. In the China space, the product-specific exclusions are still available until they expire.
Okay,
But nothing new.
So, okay, thank you so
little.
much. There is also quite a bit of interest on the China and U.S. trade. This one I'm going to use. Thank you for posing this question. So raw materials from Germany came in. They paid the, I think it's a duty import, and then they sent it to Canada, and then now they have to pay tariffs again. Is that how it's going to look like?
So that's an interesting question. If I recapture this correctly, good comes in from Germany, goes to Canada, comes right back. In that instance, you would be able to use the 9801 exemption from the tariff, which allows for previously imported goods of foreign origin to be re-imported without paying the duty a second time, as long as it was within 3 years. So you need to have your tracing for that. Now, if you've done any activity on that product in Canada, then we would need to look at whether it's a repair or alteration that's defined as a repair or alteration, and it would be subject to the Canada tariffs if they go into effect only on the value of the repair or alteration. If it's actually further processed, it's possible that there's another partial exemption. I'm sorry, no, there wouldn't be another partial exemption available. If it's further produced in Canada and then brought back as kind of something else, then you would pay full tariff on that, yes.
So still on Canada, do we know the dates and amounts of tariffs specific to Canada?
Right now, we only know that what's been threatened and what was published in a now withdrawn Federal Register notice was 25% on March 4th. As I mentioned, we have about 4 or 5 days left before that date comes upon us, and anything can happen.
Okay. So I think I will interject at this point that Deb has shared their web pages and resources, and at Florida Makes, we will continue to share also additional resources to our manufacturers. So please watch your emails and the list that we send to you. This is a general question, Deb. A manufacturer is asking, so they pay these tariffs, right? So where does that money go? And is a portion of that going to come back and help our manufacturers in some form or fashion? Do you have any insight on how those I'm going to call them revenues or funds are received?
Well, I mean, I can tell you how they're received currently. You pay the duties at importation. They go into the Treasury through customs. Customs receives it. It goes into the Treasury. What happens thereafter is quite frankly, beyond my area of expertise in terms of where it goes and what happens. And it's a good question about whether any of that revenue is going to come back to manufacturers. I think that there are a number of statements that the president has made about benefiting manufacturers. And we also know, for example, that Elon Musk has suggested, money is going back into the pockets of everyday people. But we really don't know right now whether or how any revenues might come back to directly benefit U.S. producers, workers, et cetera. We just don't know.
Again, there's a lot of moving parts to this, and the best we can do is offer you the information, the right information, as best we can as we learn the information. And the specific comment on the steel industry and aluminum, yes, you will get the information, particularly those slides from Deb that she produced for the aluminum and steel, and you can get that, and you will have her contact information as well. I think I covered all of the questions. Todd, I would like you to please address, just in general terms, as a board member, Florida Makes, some, we call this message of hope, ladies and gentlemen. So Todd is going to share a few thoughts. If you're ready, Todd, there you are.
Sure. Deb did an excellent job in her last 4 slides, which, as you mentioned, are going to be available to everyone to sort of tease the next in this series. There is a hopeful message. As I said, today is mostly the diagnosis. The next event is going to be focused on strategies for a cure, mitigation, avoiding or minimizing harm to manufacturers from these measures, and perhaps identification of opportunities. So do check the last 4 slides and be prepared for some very valuable advice in the event to come.
Thank you so much, Todd. So we will go ahead and conclude this session. I just want to show, I cannot get to my slides, but hopefully we were able to meet our key takeaways for you today. It's a very complicated topic, but we hope we had given you the ability to understand the key concepts and then the fast-moving things as is happening in today's tariff discussion. There are resources available to you, and experts such as Deb and her company are here to help mitigate those potential increase in costs that you're facing. And also additional tools and resources are coming from Florida Makes. And these are our partners. Please make sure you contact them and engage with them. And Mike, you want to say just a little something to end the session?
Absolutely. I think it's been a very informative session. I certainly learned a lot. There's a lot of opportunity out there for actions to prepare for these. Obviously, there's a lot of moving pieces, but there are a lot of things that you as manufacturers can be doing, including looking at your working capital and planning on the finance side to be able to address some of these issues. And we are very happy to work with you on how to do that and ways and strategies to make that happen. So thank you again. Thank you very much for the time, and looking forward to the next event.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Todd. Thanks, Mike. And thanks for my teammates here. We look forward to hearing from you in the survey. So we have about a month for the next tariff. So let us know what else additional information you want. From HQ in Orlando, have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.